Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Errand of Mercy, which is episode 28 of season 1 of Star Trek the Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek, one episode at a time. In this video I will cover the episode Errand of Mercy. So, Errand of Mercy is the episode where the Federation and the Klingon Empire go to war, and Kirk is sent to the planet of Organia to secure its strategic location. However, is unable to convince the peaceful inhabitants of that planet to join the Federation, and so the Klingons show up and occupy the planet and begin executing the Organians, and they still seem completely indifferent and unwilling to cooperate with Kirk. And so eventually Kirk takes matters into his own hands and starts attacking the Klingons, which leads to a conflict between Kirk and the Klingons, and while the Starfleet fleet and the Klingon fleets are about to engage themselves with each other in orbit, the Organians reveal that they are in fact super powerful energy beings, far more advanced than they are, and put a stop to the war, make it so that the Klingon Empire and the Federation literally cannot operate any of their weapons, and so they are forced to make a peace treaty and stop the war. So in these reviews, lately I've been getting into my personal history with each episode when I thought about it when I was younger. And I think that's actually relevant here as well, because when I first saw this episode as a teenager, I didn't think much of it. Now, to be fair, I don't think I ever sat down and watched the whole thing from start to finish. I think I was either not paying attention or just saw like bits and pieces of it. I always thought of it as the first episode is the Klingons, and that's about it. And I thought it was very uneventful. In fact, I used to not like the Klingons very much and like the Romulans more, because Balance of Terror was one of my favorite episodes, whereas this episode I thought was kind of just dull. But when I saw this episode in my 20s, when I was in my 20s and I was in a very sort of anti-war mood at the time, it was very go to protest against the Iraq War and stuff like that. I think it was the first time I actually sat down and watched this episode from start to finish. And when I did do that, I actually loved this episode. And then it quickly became a favorite of mine. I would put it in my top 10s, top 5s all the time, and say it's one of the best episodes of Star Trek. Now, I still put it in my top 10s, but I don't think it would quite make my top 5. I don't think it's like the best, like in the top 3 best episodes of Star Trek anymore. So I did lessen my opinion of it a little bit, but I still love this episode. I still think, when I was a teenager, I guess it was before I was very politically active and anti-war, so I think it had more meaning for me as an adult, but I also think I didn't pay much attention to it. And it's actually, looking at it now, because I was wondering if I would think it was because even recently I thought, oh, the bulk of the episode is actually kind of boring. It's the ending that's amazing. It's the ending that gets really good. But when I watched it just now for this review, I actually was engaged throughout the entire episode. And I think the way it sets up for the ending is actually what makes this episode so good, is that it earns its ending very well, and that everything fits together perfectly. So it's interesting that the character journey that Kirk goes through, because he starts the episode with saying, "A war, we don't want it, but there it is. We gotta face it." But then, he gets so frustrated with the Organians and how they apparently, do not want to listen to him at all. They don't want to do anything. They'd rather just, to him, just stand there and die. and how frustrating that is for him. And by the time we get to the reveal where the Organians like show that these powerful energy beings, and they refuse to let the clans in Starfleet fight the war, and they make it impossible for them to do so, Kirk is pissed off. He even gets really upset. It's like, you have no right to interfere. And then the Organians were like, oh, so you don't think it's okay for us to stop you from killing each other and for millions of dying in that? And I love this. This is actually very good acting from Shatner that actually gives him pause and makes him rethink, because his position, his stated position at the start of the episode is war is bad and we don't want it. And now he didn't even, without even realizing it, he was like, oh, I'm going to fight wars. And then that made him, when he was called out on it, and made him stop and go, no, that's maybe we will maybe make a peace with the Klingons. And the Organians probably point out, well, yeah, sure. I mean, you'll make peace and become good friends eventually, but in the meantime, all these people will die, and we're not going to let that happen. And it's funny, and Kor's like, oh, never. And it's funny because he is right, that in fact does happen. And by the time we get to Next Generation, which is 100 years from this, so in 100 years, Organians' prediction becomes true, which is very interesting to think about. And so it's interesting because at the end of the episode, we didn't get these annoying banter between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, which when they try to play for comedy, I hate that. I talked about that before. Thankfully, we don't get that, but we do get Kirk and Spock reflecting on the mission. But it's actually interesting because Kirk is kind of chastising himself. He's like, I fell into that trap. I can't believe I was all pro-war and wanting to fight it, and I kind of forgot the whole purpose that war is a bad thing. And so I thought overall that was a really good character development for Kirk, and it does show how a lot of times when we do think we are fighting wars for the right reasons, sometimes we get too caught up on gung-ho on attacking and lose sight of the fact that war should be avoided at all cost. And so Kirk should have welcomed the Organians' peace, and he kind of is chastising himself for not. So I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, you can tell how frustrated Kirk was with the Organians for not listening. That's part of the reason why he got caught up on it. Now, it's interesting to think about this episode in retrospect when compared to Discovery, because the Klingons, which has portrayed here, they reference Kirk references previous conflicts within it. He doesn't specifically say a war, but he does reference Klingons, conquering planets and killing people. And so I think that is a direct reference to the First War, has showed in Discovery. Now, if you think about it, and if you plug in Discovery into this, it actually makes a lot of sense that because at the end of season 2 of Discovery, or season 1, they're able to stop the war and make peace because they install an emperor or empress who is kind of amenable to the Federation. This guy is kind of pro Starfleet, and so that is what's holding off war. So one could guess, because at the start of this episode, Kirk talks about how negotiations between the Klingons is falling apart and is going to lead to war. One could guess that the reason why this peace was maintained in the 10 years, because Discovery took place 10 years before this episode, was because of that Empress was there. And so one could make the assumption that she was somehow removed from power shortly before this episode began, and that is why negotiations and relations from the Klingon Empire is falling apart, because probably another leader was installed who is more anti-Federation and wants to go back to resuming the war. And so that's why the war breaks out in this episode. Now, that's complete headcanon I'm making up, but I think that makes sense. And so, but outside of the whole Discovery thing, not getting into how terrible they looked and how they said Kalish, which annoyed me, but this is the first appearance of the Klingons, of course, in Star Trek. Now, when I first saw this episode, part of the reason why I didn't think much of it is because I thought that the Klingons weren't a very interesting adversary. I thought the Romulans were more interesting because I saw Balance of Terror and liked Balance of Terror. But it's funny because there's a quote from DC Fontana herself who I said the same thing, that she thought the Romulans would have made a better reoccurring villain, but the reason why the Klingons became ones because their makeup was a lot cheaper because they didn't have the Vulcan ears. I mean, that wouldn't be true of TNG, DS9, Voyager times for sure. Their makeup is far more elaborate, but for the original series, it was cheaper, and so that's why they became the reoccurring adversary. But, looking back on it, I actually think this episode did portray them as a very interesting villain. I think where they went wrong in Season 2, because, and I talked about this before, and I'll get more into this when I cover the episodes of Season 2. I don't like the portrayal of the Klingons in Season 2. They came off as more like Ferengi or other, just stupid villains. But its portrayal here in Season 1 was good, and actually is consistent with how the Klingons would become portrayed in the rest of the franchise, with, starting with the movies Next Generation DS9. And the third season episode, Day of the Dove, was also a really good. In fact, that episode, arguably, the Klingons were even more like how we would know them to be in Next Generation DS9, as they're all honor-based. But yeah, so DS9 brought back 3 Klingon characters from the original series, Kor from this episode being one of them, and he's very consistent. I can definitely see this being the same character. And Kang from Day of the Dove, which is also very consistent. I can see that being the same character, but the other character was Koloth, who appeared in the second season episode Trouble with Tribbles, when the Klingons were being portrayed totally different, and he's totally inconsistent, and I can't buy it's the same character at all, because that's when he was like, "My dear Captain Kirk." So it shows that the Klingons actually, here it portrays them as, warlike, power hungry, and you can see that I say that Kang and Day of the Dove has that more honor-based feeling, but Kor actually, you can really see him connecting up with the Klingons that we know from later in the franchise, because he respects Kirk instantly. He doesn't even know Kirk is, Starfleet. He thinks he's Organian, but as soon as he sees him and sees all the other Organians are smiling, and he's so annoyed by that, and the fact that Kirk is standoffish warms him to Kirk immediately, and he instantly respects Kirk, and even when he finds out who he is, he still respects him. So it kind of is similar to the way they portrayed General Chang in Undiscovered Country, who's the villain who was actively trying to undermine and kill Kirk, but at the same time had a lot of respect for him, and warrior to warrior. And you get that feeling with Kor as well, that he has a lot of respect for the warrior class of Starfleet. He's just going to try to kill them and defeat them, because that's how war goes, but he still respects them. But the Organian, and he even talked about how, he was going to spare the life of the Organians. He's like, "I hope life tastes sweet to you, coward." He was disgusted by their pacifism. And so that's very consistent with how the Klingons will come to be portrayed in the rest of the franchise. And plus, it makes him a very interesting character in this one episode itself. And so that was something really interesting as well. And let me get into the Organians now, because the Organians, they could come off through the bulk of this episode as being compared to, because there are some cultures that are really pacifist, like to a fault, where they'll let themselves be wiped out rather than commit any violence, kind of like those aliens from Mirror Mirror. And one could be confused to compare them to them, but they're actually not, because they're cheating. Because they're not willing to die to uphold their ideals, because they're not actually dying. It's like at the end of the episode, Kirk even like says, like throughout the episode, Kirk and Spock have this thing going on where there's odds. Spock says the odds of our surviving this or whatever, and odds start to go down, but they're always ridiculously high. And at the end of the episode, Spock's like, well, we did beat the odds, and Kirk's like, no, we did not beat the odds, because the Organians had the whole game rigged. And that's correct. Like, the Organians are cheating. They had this whole thing rigged, so they're not really, I mean, they're pacifists, but because they have the power to be, because they were never in any danger in the first place, and so they're cheating. So I wouldn't compare them to these pacifist cultures who'd be willing to, because they're not willing to lay their life down, because they were never in any danger in the first place. And I do like, to be fair to them, they continually point this out to Kirk. They continually try to tell him, we're not in any danger. We are not in any danger. And Kirk is just thinking they're being dumb and obtuse and like, how can I convince you the danger you're in? And naive. But in fact, they are correct. And Kirk just doesn't realize that when they say that, they mean it. They actually aren't in any danger. And I love how they hint at this throughout the episode. Like, they had that one dude who's able to, like, oh, the Klingon troops are beaming down, they're occupying the courtyard. He's just sitting right there in the same room as Kirk with no monitor or communicator or anything in front of him. And Kirk's like, how the fuck would he know that? And the other guy's just like, nah, trust him, he knows it. This is great setup, great foreshadowing. But this could lead to a possible nitpick. However, I'm okay with it, and you could say I kind of have fansplaining or headcanon to be okay with it. But the nitpick could be, why didn't the Organians just tell Kirk in the first place? Right up, be up front with them. We are energy beings and we can't be killed. We're far more advanced than you. So don't worry about it. Just go away. Save yourselves, because you're the ones in danger. We're actually not in danger because we're supreme energy beings and Klingons can't hurt us. And you might argue, well, maybe Kirk wouldn't believe that, but they could, turn into energy like they did at the end of the episode and go, woo, 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 and prove that they're energy beings, or do something magical like, make the weapons hot like they did at the end of the episode. But they specifically withhold the information that they are, these superior energy beings, and it's convenient for the plot. That way we had that big reveal at the end. However, as I said, don't have an issue with it. I'm okay with it, because my headcanon, I think this actually makes a lot of sense. I don't think this is fan-splitting. I think this actually fits with the episode. Is the Organians have a kind of non-interference policy, kind of like the Prime Directive, which was portrayed in the Enterprise prequel episode, Observer Effect. But it's clear in this episode that they have a non-interference, because they talk about in the end of the episode how distasteful it is to interfere, because when they're forced to stop the war, like, they're beginning to talk amongst themselves, and like, do we have to? Like, that is really distasteful, and don't like interfering in their policies. And the other guy's like, I'm sorry, but it looks like we gotta. So I think their sort of non-interference or prime directive is why they're withholding this information from Kirk, because they don't want him to know. It's none of his damn business that they're energy beings. So they're trying to write us like, trust me, we're fine. You're the one that's in danger, so skedaddle. So that makes sense to me, actually, why they wouldn't volunteer that information, because they don't want Kirk to know that they're energy beings. This is only at the end where they're forced to reveal themselves in order to stop the conflict, that they finally do reveal themselves as being energy beings. And yeah, and so and it lines up, by the way, with the observer effect, but that's more of a compliment to observer effect, because that was made way after this one, which, by the way, I do love that episode of Enterprise, which is a prequel to this, was showing the Organians, and at that point in stage they had a very strict non-interference, but by the end of the episode you got one Organian convincing the other that they need to intercede, they need to show compassion, and if they can save lives, they should. And so that would explain this episode, why they do intercede to save lives at the end of it, and also explains why they were reluctant to do so and really don't like doing so, but at the end they're like, I guess we gotta. And so that totally tracks with the ending of Observer Effect. Now, one could ask why they have these buildings and they have a whole bunch of people living in these villages. And plus, Kirk, the Federation had made contact with them before. Starfleet is aware, so they've been taking humanoid form and hanging out in these, primitive buildings for a while. Again, one could say that they, after the events of Observer Effect, they decided to sort of experience what it's like to be humanoid, so that they could, being humanoid and living as humanoids would help them sort of sympathize and understand them better, because we do see they were observing them, so they obviously were interested in the humanoid life forms and wanted to learn about them. So what better way to learn about them than to actually live as them for a while. So I think, again, this is headcanon, but for me that would make sense why they were living as humanoids. But by the end of this episode, they kind of had their fill with them. Like they even said, it's like being around you is a little painful, which that does seem a bit harsh. If it's that painful, so why even take humanoid form and make contact with them? But whatever. But yeah, so it makes sense of why they, by the end of the episode, because they had to interfere and be involved in this whole incident, they're like, yeah, we're good, and go back to their energy form and just fuck off. So I like the Organians and how they're portrayed in this episode, and I think it has a. As I said, I think the ending is a very, very powerful anti-war message that I like. As I talked about with the character's journey of Kirk, when he's realizing he got tricked into being, I want to fight a war. But I actually like the Organians, and I think their policy of, they're kind of in the cheating, and they're in a position where they're never in any danger in the first place, so it's easy for them to be anti-war because they're not in any danger. But I love the idea that this is portrayed as the right thing to do, to physically prevent these two powers from starting a war, which would kill millions, and by stopping the war and negotiating is the right thing. Now, furthermore, I think I would go as far as to say that this is what the Federation and Starfleet's policy or philosophy is as well. That they want to avoid war at all costs, that they think it's a terrible thing, but the difference with them is they're not super energy beings, so when there is a force where negotiations fail, they aren't gonna just be like, the dudes from Mirror and sit there and let themselves be slaughtered. They are gonna stand up and to protect other people who are being slaughtered. They will stand up and fight for what's right, but that's because they have to, because they're not these super energy beings. And the best they can do, they're not just gonna roll over and let people be slaughtered and killed, so they will fight in return. And that's why the thing with Kirk is that he kind of lost sight of that. He lost sight of that, the fact that but I do still think that it is the Federation's standing policy. It's especially true with when you get into Picard and Pike. And it's interesting getting, because with Strange New Worlds, I had that episode when they revisited Balance of Terror. In that case, Kirk's pro-war stance was actually correct and actually prevented a war, his pro-attack, because how he attacked the Romulans is what stopped the war, but Pike's more pacifistic view actually started a war that killed millions. But in this case, Kirk is actually in the wrong. His whole attack first would have actually led to the death of millions, and the pacifism is what stopped it. Which is an interesting way to look at it. And so I think the Federation would take the Organians, if they had these magical powers where they could just instantly stop wars, they would. But they don't, so the only powers they really had to them is negotiating. And that's why we see how they try to negotiate to stop wars at all costs. Now, this could get controversial when it comes to the Cardassians, because arguably because of the creation of the demilitarized zone and giving away Federation worlds, it could be argued that the Cardassians out-negotiated them and was taking advantage of the fact that they knew that Starfleet would avoid war at all costs, so the Cardassians would try to get more things out of it and manipulate the Federation that way. So that could be controversial. And then other cases where it's clear that negotiation wouldn't work is when the Federation has to resort to war. Like the Borg is probably the best example of a race that absolutely cannot be negotiated with, and negotiations are futile. And, of course, with Dominion, they tried negotiations. And then, again, we had that episode, The Search, where Sisko saw that the Dominion would have tried to take advantage and conquer the Federation through negotiation had they attempted that. And then they just saw the negotiation, and they knew that negotiations wouldn't work with Dominion because they were just hell-bent on conquering and didn't care, and they were going to try whatever they could to destabilize and conquer the region. And so war was the only option there as well. But it's always a last resort, which is what separates the Starfleet from the Klingons, particularly in this episode, that they're not exactly the same, because the Klingons welcome war and they want war, where the Starfleet do want to avoid war at all costs. But sometimes you just have to fight in order to do that. So, there was it's another little interesting thing to think about. So the other thing I was thinking about in this episode, we see, apparently this is the first and only time we see, or maybe first, not only, but we see Sulu in the command chair. And we did see Sulu take command of the Enterprise before in Arena, but he actually was commanding from the helm. This time we actually see him in the captain's chair. And I didn't realize this before, but Scotty, you would think that whenever Kirk and Spock leave, Scotty's the one who takes command of the Enterprise, not Sulu. But apparently, there were 3 times where someone else had to take command of the Enterprise in Season 1, and Sulu did twice, once in this episode, once in Arena, and the other one was Taste of Armageddon, which was Scotty. And so it seems like they hadn't really decided at this stage. And plus, like in Arena in this episode, Scotty wasn't in it, and in The Taste of Armageddon, Sulu wasn't in it. So it seems like whichever one was available was the one who would take command of the Enterprise. But Season 2 is where they would establish the normal method of Scotty being third in command after Spock and Kirk and Spock. So that wasn't actually established yet. And then there's that, but I guess to the episode The Deadly Years, which I'll get to eventually, where Sulu could have taken command, but the Commodore was like, oh, I'm not going to turn it over to a junior officer. It's like, he's not a junior officer, he's taken command several times. But anyway, that was not good of an episode. Speaking of precedents, apparently this is the last time they used the term Vulcanian instead of Vulcan. And it's funny because when I first did my season by season review and I binged watched season 1 all at once, them referring to Vulcans as Vulcanian was driving me up the walls. And it was driving me nuts every time they said Vulcanian. I'm like, no, Vulcanian. But it's funny because this time around I barely even noticed. Like, it wasn't like when I read the trivia that said, oh, this is the last time they say Vulcanian. It was like, oh, I haven't even noticed them saying Vulcanian. I guess they've done it here and there, but it hasn't really, like, didn't notice it that much. So I guess it's the difference between binge watching, because I guess binge watching it was more apparent and because I kept hearing it over and over again, but here I'm watching it very gradually over several months, so it doesn't stick in my mind as much, but and which is how, you know, people would watch it when they first aired. But yeah, the Vulcanian thing was a bit annoying. But yeah, apparently from now on, and I know that was definitely true of a mock time, that they say Vulcan, that they don't say Vulcanian. But yeah, that was, and apparently in this episode they both said Vulcan and Vulcanian. Whatever that's about. Another interesting piece of trivia for this episode is there was a song that came out in the 80s. It was like a new wave electronic song that's it was a one-hit wonder, I think. It was a song that goes, I want to know what you're thinking. Tell me what's on your mind. Anyway, they use an audio clip of Spock saying pure energy. And so they used that throughout the song. In fact, the song is called What's on Your Mind, in parentheses, pure energy. He goes, pure energy. And I remember when that song first came out in the late 80s, and I heard that it was actually a clip from Star Trek of Spock. But of course, at that stage, I had never seen Star Trek, and it wasn't until when I saw this episode for the first time, as soon as Spock said pure energy, I was like, hey, that's the thing from the song that they took. And so now every time I watch that episode when he says pure energy, I always think of this song, which I went back and watched the video for it after watching the episode just now, and it's like the most 80s video. It's like it couldn't be more 80s if Ronald Reagan himself and Michael Jackson were singing. It was so incredibly 80s. But and they played a clip of Dr. McCoy at the start of it, but I don't know what episode that's from. But anyway, I always think that's an interesting piece of trivia regarding this episode. Yeah, I think this is a really good episode. A really strong episode that I like. And yeah, it does drag a bit, but the more I think about it, the more I think it's not boring at the start, because it does establish Kirk's character journey and establishes Kor as a very interesting villain. One of the best villains of this show, to be honest. And they did try to bring him back for Day of the Dove, but they couldn't get the actor, so they made up King instead, who's also good. So, yeah. Overall, I do really like this episode. So now, let's get into thanking the patrons. Thanks so much for all those who support the channel. Of course, always very much appreciate the lifeblood of this channel. Keep it going. Can't just say how much is appreciated. So Patreon supporters, we have Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Avals, Brian A., Alessandro Migalicio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so very much for your support. So now let's get into a few Patreon comments about this video. I think we have 2 this time. First one is from Ricky, who says, another great social commentary episode. This, in my humble opinion, is the best Klingon episode in TOS. The way they acted and behaved was totally in line with Klingons that we know in the TNG, DS9, and Voyager. This is also another episode that's better in current times than in the 60s. I think the plot twist at the end was great, and the Organians were an interesting species and race. By the way, I also love their appearance in Enterprise episode Observer Effect in Season 4. Though I do think that this episode is better, that episode is better than this one. But like I said, I love this episode. It's in my personal top 10 TOS episodes, so my rating is a 9 out of 10. And again, I guess that's why Ricky is a strong supporter of my channel, because me and Ricky are always seem to be on the same page. Pretty much what I was saying, this is also in my top 10. I love this episode, although I do think I like this episode better than Observer Effects. So I guess that's one slight place, but that's such a minor disagreement. But yeah, I also think this is the best Klingon episode of TOS, easily. Alright, so other comment is from Brandon Neal Howells. Says, Errand of Mercy. I like this episode a lot, but damn, the Organians piss me off. They're placid to the point of apathy. The story only gets interesting when the Klingons arrive and occupy the planet. The Organian Council are sheep, and I'm sorry that they're the only Organians we meet. It's a joy to watch the rapport between the 2 warriors, Kor and Kirk. The 2 of them arguing over who is going to provide aid to the Organians make me smile every time I watch. The fact that the Organians turn out to be non-corporeal energy beings always seems like cheating, though. Worthy of note, for the last time that Spock is referred to as Vulcanian. Yes. 7 out of 10. Yeah, so the Organians are cheating. I definitely agree with that. But I kind of disagree about them being placid to the point of apathy because of the fact they're cheating. That they have that ace up their sleeves. It's not so much that they're apathetic, it's that they're like invincible. it's that they have that ace card that no one else is aware of, and they're never in any danger in the first place, and that's why they don't annoy me, and they actually come off as kind of badass to me. The fact they're like, oh yeah, no, we're not in any danger, Kirk, we're fine, don't worry about us, just fuck off and worry about yourselves. But anyway, that's just me. So my rating for Errand of Mercy out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. I think I always go back and forth between a 9 and a 10. I love this episode a lot, and it's definitely top tier. TOS definitely, as I said, makes my top 10. Maybe even top 5. I don't know. That's arguable. But I don't think it quite gets a 10. Because it's as much as I do love it, it doesn't have the best parts of it. Is definitely an ending. Even though I appreciate the bulk more with building up Kirk's character, it doesn't have that 10 quality until we get to the very end. So I don't think I can quite give it a 10, but it is a very strong 9 out of 10 for me. So that's it for my review of Errand of Mercy. Thanks so much for watching. So Coming up on my channel next Wednesday will be my revisited video for City on the Edge of Forever, which will be over on Patreon for my Patreon supporters, where I will revisit my review of City on the Edge of Forever, and I will give a little sneak peek for that video. Is that it's probably going to be really long, because my review that I did for City on the Edge of Forever is probably one of my least favorite reviews that I did. I think I really did not do a good job and did not do that great episode justice. So I'm looking forward to getting a second chance and talking about this episode some more. And then on Thursday, we'll be back on my main channel for the whole public for Operation Annihilate, an episode that, in contrast, I don't like. And then on Saturday, we'll jump into start season 2 of the original series with my Cat's Paw review. So that's what's coming up on the channel, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.